In the next microstructure, we want to observe the elements that are parallel in the first and second protections, that is, units 2b1 and 2b2. 2b1, you'll see, spans verses 12 to 15. 2b2 spans verses 16 through 19. When comparing the two persons against whom wisdom can protect the youth, certain parallels emerge. First, the sage opens each unit with this statement, "in order to rescue you from," and then proceeds to describe the respective hazardous persons in terms of what they say. We're focusing here on verses 12 and 16. In 12, in order to rescue you from a harmful way, from a man who utters shifting things. Notice the emphasis on what he says. And in verse 16, in order to rescue you from the foreign woman, from the strange woman, she has lubricated her words. Lubricated, she has slippery words. It's hard to pin her down. Second in the sequence, the sage identifies their respective points of failure, each in terms of having abandoned something that they should instead have cherished. So verse 13, protection then, or rescue from those who abandon paths of honesty. And 17, rescue from one who abandons the companion of her youth. So the man abandoned honest paths in favor of dark, covert ways. The woman has abandoned her friend from youth and forgets even the covenant with her God. Third, in this parallel pattern, the youth learns of the harm which those figures have embraced, whether inflicting harm on others, and that we find in 14 for the malicious man, and 19 for the malicious woman, or inflicting harm on themselves. That takes place in the last verse concerning the evil man, verse 15, and in the next to last verse of the harmful woman. By chiastically inverting these last items, that is, articulating whether it's harming self or harming others, the closing picture of the negative man portrays him suffering the stupidity of self-inflicted harm, reminiscent of the final picture of the stupid suicidal gang back in chapter 1, verse 19. They think they're so strong inflicting harm on others, they wind up inflicting harm of a deadly sort on themselves. Now, what about the negative woman? At the same time, the final picture of the negative woman portrays her even more ominously, inflicting mortal damage on others, with the intensification of a summation. Notice verse 19. None of those who approach her will return, nor will they ever attain the paths of life. This word none, the negation of all. This is a summation. It's extremely powerful, particularly when it comes at the close, as it does here, the close of verses 16 through 19. So with this intensification of the summation, the final verse describing the woman, verse 19, declares that none may escape death who foolishly succumb to her siren call. Surely the youth himself could not even escape death, were he not under Lady Wisdom's protection instead. This brings us to the last of the microstructures, namely a character summary, operating in the last two verses of section 3, verses 21 and 22. Let's read those once again. Verse 21, mark this, it is the honest who will settle in the land, and blameless ones are the ones who will be left standing there. But it is the guilty who will be cut off from the land, as the violent are the ones who will tear away from it. With this character summary, the sage draws to a close this poem spanning all of chapter 2. With this character summary, furthermore, he confronts the pupil with two behavioral alternatives, confronting him in a manner that is as unmistakable as it is unavoidable. One must choose to align either with the honest, blameless, or with the guilty, violent. Even the sound of characters selected in verses 21a and 22a highlight for the hearers this ineluctable choice. Will he side with the yesharim, the honest, or with the rishaim, the guilty? Hear those sounds again for their similarity. Yesharim, rishaim, the honest or the guilty. By drawing the subjects of the sentence to the front of each hemistich or half verse, the sage slows the speech to a ponderous pace, leaving no question as to the sage's focus. At issue is the land, how long one will last in it. Recalling the lofty benefit of a secure dwelling, which closed Proverbs 1, the sage now probes whether the pupil would prefer such safeguarded resilience enjoyed by the honest blameless over against certain destruction awaiting the guilty violent. And here we are recalling chapter 1, verse 33. The youth's chosen quest, whether after wisdom or otherwise, will spell his own conclusion. As we wrap up our study concerning Proverbs 2, let's recap what we've seen here. In this lecture, the sage holds in his gaze a youth who has expressed initial receptivity toward Lady Wisdom's invitation that was extended in the last half of Proverbs 1, chapter 1, verses 20 to 33. Fanning those flames of initial interest, the sage now urges the reader, then as now, to display a determined pursuit that will move beyond merely casual interest. That determined pursuit must not flag when wisdom lies a bit beyond convenient reach, nor give up when one must rouse oneself to call out after her, or even hunt her as a miner would labor at a thin vein of precious ore in a dark mine shaft. And there we're recapping verses 1 through 4. Such a diligent quest after wisdom is well worth the effort, due to the considerable array of rewards and protections that follow. Verses 5 through 19. The supreme reward consists of nothing other than this: attaining reverence toward the Lord, a reward that breaks forth in verse 5 immediately after the most intense degree of minor-like questing after wisdom that we saw in verse 4. The reader has known of the worth of reverence since the book's introduction, where fear of the Lord stood as the epitome of wisdom, Proverbs 1:7. Conversely, failure to value reverence marked the fool's chief liability in chapter 1, verse 29. Given the poem's careful arrangement, as suggested by the outline we've already studied, the notion that reference here in verse 5 to the divine would have been added as a later insertion seems highly unlikely. Professor Fox makes this observation. He says, it is improbable that the tightly knit structure of this chapter would have resulted from multiple intrusions. We make this point because some have speculated that any time within Proverbs 1 through 9 there is mention of God, in particular the God of Israel, this was a later addition. So we see that the tightly knit structure of Proverbs 2 makes that speculation really untenable. Rather, the sage delivered his most important point at the point of maximum impact. The sage thus teaches that diligent search enjoined in verses 1 through 4, surely will lead to discovery, but not discovery of mere information. Rather, the pupil will attain knowledge of a person no less than God himself. This we see in verse 5, part B. It is the prospect of this sublime acquaintance that fuels the entire wisdom quest. For the sage, grasping wisdom and thereby attaining reverence toward God comprises no sanctimonious goal divorced from implications for healthy human community. Rather, that same achievement of wisdom necessarily plays out in moral character that will inevitably be evident in community relationships. And we're focusing now on verses 9 through 11. Claims of wisdom, absent the evidence of ethical conduct towards one's neighbor, the sage would discount as merely swaggering hypocrisy. In addition to rightly aligning one's entire life orientation by attaining reverence, and in addition to building moral character that creates a web of rich and trustworthy relationships, wisdom offers a benefit that the naive may suppose they do not need. For, unlike the sage, as yet the naive have not yet encountered the malevolent man whose words shift over time like sinking shadows, verses 12 to 15. As yet, the naive may not have crossed paths with the woman who in slippery fashion entertains guests who are blind to the deadly trap into which they have blundered, verses 16 through 19. Against such a man and against such a woman, wisdom offers exactly what the traveler needs, namely rescue. Which way will the youth, and we today, travel? We must choose. If we side with wisdom and the ethical life found there, not only will we gain these safeguards, but we will graduate to become agents of protection for others around us. Verse 20. Else we will be party to those who forfeit durable security, who lose their place in community, and are responsible for violently dismantling its very fabric. Verses 21 and 22. Twin prospects that are introduced here in Proverbs 2, namely right relations with God and right relations in human community, these two will occupy the ensuing chapter in expanded fashion, especially the first 12 verses of Proverbs 3 and the closing verses spanning 27 through 35. However, instead of portraying the two as benefits which follow the quest of wisdom, when we come to Proverbs 3, these two will take on the shape of clusters of pointed injunctions, specific wisdom content. These, in fact, comprise the first particular instructions to be found in all of Proverbs, aside from those exhortations we've already seen to pursue wisdom, which we class as wisdom commendations. Between those two parts, the beginning and end of Proverbs 3, we find a poem extolling the value of wisdom, Proverbs 13 through 26. In the next study, we will begin our examination of Proverbs 3.